The winter of 1536 was cruel in England. The wind howled through the stone walls of Greenwich Palace, carrying with it the whispers of court intrigue and betrayal. Inside those walls, a little girl of barely 3 years clutched a small wooden doll and stared at the closed doors. Her name was Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, once the most admired woman in England, now condemned as a traitor. That morning, the palace was unnaturally silent. No footsteps of servants, no distant music, no laughter. Elizabeth's governess, Lady Bryan, had forbidden her from going to the courtyard. "You must stay inside, my lady," she said gently, though her eyes betrayed fear. Elizabeth did not understand. All she knew was that her mother had not come to kiss her goodnight. Far away in the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn awaited her fate. The queen who once promised that her daughter would rule England now stood on the cold stones of her cell praying for mercy that would never come. When the sword fell, a dynasty trembled and a child became motherless. For Elizabeth, the world changed in a single moment. She was no longer a princess. Her mother's death stripped her of her title, her fortune, and her place at court. She was now called Lady Elizabeth, a reminder of disgrace. Servants bowed less deeply, whispers followed her wherever she went. Yet in the heart of that child, something unbroken remained, a spark of dignity, perhaps even pride. Years passed. Elizabeth grew into a thoughtful girl with fiery red hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her tutors taught her Latin, Greek, and philosophy, and she absorbed every word as though knowledge could shield her from the world's cruelty. "Study, Elizabeth," her teacher once said, "for wisdom is a crown no one can take from you." And she did more fiercely than anyone imagined. When her father married Jane Seymour, Elizabeth's place at court became even more uncertain. The birth of her half-brother, Prince Edward, pushed her further from the line of succession, but she never complained. Even as a child, she learned to smile when others watched and to remain silent when they did not. Beneath that calm exterior lay a storm of questions she could never ask aloud. Why did my mother die? Why must I pay for her sins? Why does my father look away when I bow? At the age of 13, Elizabeth moved between royal estates Hatfield, Chelsea, and Woodstock, often isolated from her siblings. She loved books more than people. Words never betrayed her. Her letters, written in perfect handwriting, revealed a mind far older than her years. She began to understand politics, religion, and the dangerous dance of survival in the Tudor court. Then came Catherine Parr, her father's sixth and final wife. Unlike the others, Catherine treated Elizabeth with warmth and respect. Under her care, the young princess returned to court and found something close to family. Catherine encouraged her studies and reintroduced her to her half-sister Mary. For the first time, Elizabeth felt seen not as a mistake, but as a Tudor. Yet even this brief peace carried its shadows. When King Henry died in 1547, the court fell into chaos. Edward, now a boy king, was placed under the control of powerful men who saw Elizabeth not as a child but as a pawn. One of them, Thomas Seymour, Catherine's new husband, became dangerously close to her. He was charming, reckless, and ambitious. Elizabeth, barely 14, did not understand the full danger until it was too late. His late-night visits, his teasing words, the whispers spread quickly. When Catherine discovered the truth, she sent Elizabeth away. The scandal almost ruined her. Alone once again, Elizabeth learned a lesson that would define her life. Trust was a luxury a queen could not afford. By the time she was 20, she had mastered the art of caution. Her half-brother Edward ruled England as a Protestant reformer, while her half-sister Mary, devoutly Catholic, watched from the shadows. When Edward died young, the kingdom erupted in confusion. Mary seized the throne, and Elizabeth, as the next Protestant heir, became a threat overnight. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had met death. The rain fell heavily as the gates closed behind her, and the echoes of chains filled the air. Inside those cold, damp walls, she knelt and whispered a prayer. "I am not my mother," she murmured, her voice trembling. "God knows my heart." Days turned into weeks. Spies watched her every move, guards waited for a single misstep. Elizabeth wrote letters to Queen Mary pleading her innocence. "I never plotted against you, sister," she wrote. "I ask only for your mercy." For a time, silence was her only answer. One dawn, she heard footsteps outside her cell. The door creaked open. "The Queen has ordered your release," said the guard. Elizabeth's knees nearly gave way. She had survived. As she stepped out into the grey light of the courtyard, the The tower loomed behind her, vast, unfeeling, eternal. She looked up at the ravens circling above and made a silent vow. If I ever wear the crown of England, I will never again bow to fear. She was only 21, but her eyes held the weight of generations. The orphaned child had grown into a woman forged by loss, betrayal, and solitude. In the distance, the bells of London tolled, and Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of the condemned Queen, walked into destiny. The bells of Westminster rang on a cold November morning in 1558. The kingdom was shrouded in mourning. Queen Mary was dead, and with her the shadow of persecution that had hung over England for years. As dawn broke through the fog, a quiet figure walked through the corridors of Hatfield House, her breath visible in the winter air. Elizabeth Tudor, at 25, was about to become Queen of England. When the messengers knelt before her, she did not smile. Instead, she looked toward the grey sky and whispered, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." The words carried no triumph, only the solemn weight of destiny. She had survived exile, imprisonment, and suspicion. Now the crown that had destroyed her mother would rest upon her own head. Her coronation, held at Westminster Abbey in January 1559, was unlike any other. The people who once doubted her now cheered her name as she rode through London on a white horse, her red hair blazing like fire beneath the winter sun. The air was filled with the cries of "God save the Queen," and for the first time in her life Elizabeth felt not fear, but belonging. She was England's hope, the ruler who might heal the wounds of faith and bring peace to a divided nation. But peace was not easily won. The scars left by her sister's reign ran deep. Protestants and Catholics eyed one another with suspicion. Noblemen whispered of rebellion. Foreign powers watched closely, waiting for the young queen to falter. Elizabeth's council begged her to marry to choose a husband who could protect her throne and produce an heir. Spain offered its prince. France hinted at alliance. But Elizabeth's answer was always the same, a polite, unyielding refusal. "I will have but one mistress here," she told her courtiers, "and no master." To the world she was the Virgin Queen, untouched and untamed. But behind the golden curtains of her court, Elizabeth was a woman torn between heart and duty. Among those closest to her stood Robert Dudley, the charming, daring nobleman she had known since childhood. His laughter filled the halls of Whitehall, and when she looked at him, the burdens of the crown seemed to fade for a moment. Whispers began to spread. The court murmured of secret meetings, stolen glances, letters burned at dawn. But Robert Dudley was married, and scandal was a luxury the Queen could never afford. When his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, the rumour that Elizabeth had conspired to rid herself of a rival spread like wildfire. The tragedy nearly destroyed her. For weeks she withdrew from public view, mourning not only Amy's death, but the loss of the one friendship that had truly touched her heart. From then on, she built a fortress around her emotions. She smiled for her people, charmed her enemies, and wielded words like weapons. Her mind became her greatest defence. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to promise without binding herself, to flatter without revealing intent. Her council feared her as much as they adored her. Yet the dangers around her never ceased. Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and rival, became a beacon for Catholic plots. Beautiful, reckless, and beloved in Europe, Mary was everything Elizabeth was not. To many, she was the rightful Queen of England. Elizabeth wrestled with her conscience. She did not want to kill a fellow queen, a woman who had once called her sister. But after years of conspiracies and assassination attempts, she had no choice. In 1587, Mary Stuart was executed. When the axe fell, Elizabeth locked herself in her chambers and wept for days. "She is dead," she whispered, "and I am stained forever." The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, changed everything. In Spain, King Philip II, once Elizabeth's brother-in-law, vowed revenge. He called upon his vast empire, assembling an armada of ships to invade England and restore it to Catholic rule. The threat was unlike any Elizabeth had faced before. It was not intrigue or rumour, now it was war. The air in London grew heavy with fear. Priests prayed, blacksmiths forged weapons, and sailors crowded the ports. Elizabeth's advisers urged her to hide, to let her generals lead. But the Queen refused to cower. "If my people fight," she said, "then I shall fight beside them." On the eve of battle she rode to Tilbury, dressed in silver armour that gleamed beneath the overcast sky. Thousands of soldiers gathered, mud splattering their boots, faces pale but resolute. Elizabeth rode among them, her red hair unbound, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "My loving people," she began, "we have been persuaded by some that we are careful of our safety, but I assure you I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too." The soldiers erupted in cheers, their fear transformed into devotion. In that moment, Elizabeth ceased to be merely a queen. She became the embodiment of England itself, proud, unyielding, and eternal. When news reached her that the Spanish Armada had been scattered by English fire and the furious North Sea winds, she bowed her head and whispered a prayer of gratitude. God blew, and they were scattered. England had survived, and so had she. But victory carried its own loneliness. The men she trusted most grew old and died. William Cecil, her faithful adviser, Robert Dudley, the man she'd loved but never claimed. One by one they left her. The palace grew quieter each year, the mirrors reflecting a face more lined, more weary, yet still radiant with purpose. By the time Elizabeth entered her late 60s, the laughter of her youth had faded into memory. Her court still adored her, but she could feel the whispers behind the silks and jewels. Who will rule when she is gone? She had no heir, no husband, no child to carry her bloodline. But she had something greater, a nation reborn in her image. In the stillness of her private chambers, Elizabeth sometimes thought of her mother. She would touch the small ring she wore, one that secretly held a miniature portrait of Anne Boleyn. "They took everything from you," she would whisper softly, "but they could not destroy your daughter." Outside her window, the bells of London tolled once more, just as they had when she first took the throne. Only now, they rang for her glory and for the fleeting passage of time. Winter had returned to England, colder and quieter than before. The court at Richmond Palace stood in a hush of candlelight and heavy velvet curtains. The Queen, who had once ruled with fire in her eyes, now sat silently by the window, her frail hands resting on a cushion embroidered with golden lilies. The air smelled faintly of roses, her favourite scent, though she no longer noticed it. Time had become her only companion. Elizabeth was now nearly 70, and every movement betrayed the weight of her years. Her once bright hair, the flame of her youth, had turned pale and brittle beneath her wig. Yet her eyes, sharp, watchful, undimmed, still carried the strength of the woman who had defied kings, popes, and armies. But behind those eyes, shadows grew longer each day. Her beloved Robert Dudley had been gone for more than a decade. When news of his death reached her, she had locked herself away and refused to eat. She kept his last letter beside her bed until her own final days, calling it his last testament of love. She never allowed anyone to speak ill of him. To others, she was the Virgin Queen, but within the silence of her chambers, she was simply Elizabeth, a woman who had loved once and lost forever. Her nights were restless. Sleep eluded her, memories did not. Sometimes she saw her mother's face young, smiling, full of hope, and then the flash of steel, the fall of the blade. Other times she saw herself at Tilbury, armour shining, heart blazing with courage she could no longer summon. The past was no longer history, it was a haunting, a series of echoes she could not silence. Her counsellors, now mostly young men who had not known her in her prime, urged her to name a successor. "Your Majesty must secure the realm," they said gently, but she turned away. "When I am gone," she replied, "let the crown find its own head." To name an heir was to admit the end, and Elizabeth had never been a woman to yield. Still, she felt the creeping approach of death. The great halls of her palaces grew colder, her steps slower. She no longer wished to be surrounded by courtiers and flattery. She preferred solitude, the company of silence, where she could speak to her memories freely. Her ladies-in-waiting often found her standing for hours unmoving, lost in thought. When they begged her to rest, she would smile faintly and say, "A rest is for those who have finished their work. Mine is not yet done." But deep down, she knew it was. England had changed, and she had changed with it. The proud young queen who had once inspired a nation to stand against the world was now a living legend, an image of majesty and endurance. The people still adored her, but fewer of them remembered the girl who had once been called Lady Elizabeth, the orphan child who had survived disgrace and fear. One evening, a storm rolled over the Thames, the wind rattled the windows and thunder echoed across the darkened sky. Elizabeth ordered her attendants to leave her alone. She sat by the fire, the flickering light playing across her face. On her finger glimmered the ring with her mother's portrait. She turned it slowly, tracing the outline of the tiny face inside. "We did it, Mother," she whispered. "They will remember us." Her mind drifted between past and present, between the child who had lost everything and the queen who had built an empire. She thought of Shakespeare, whose play she had loved, of the ships that sailed the seas under her name, of the people who called her Gloriana. but glory could not fill the emptiness that lingered in her heart. Power had been her crown, but loneliness had been her throne. By March of 1603, she could no longer rise from her bed. Her doctors hovered helplessly, their remedies useless against the slow fading of her spirit. She refused food, refused sleep, refused the prayers of those who knelt beside her. "I am tired of life and of myself," she said softly. "There is no need for more words." When Robert Cecil, her last faithful minister, asked who should succeed her, she did not answer at first. Then, with effort, she raised a trembling hand and pointed north towards Scotland. It was enough. They understood. The crown would pass to James VI of Scotland, uniting the two kingdoms under one monarch. Her reign, the Tudor dynasty itself, would end with her. That night, as candles burned low, Elizabeth lay surrounded by silence. Her ladies wept quietly nearby, but the Queen did not weep. She stared into the shadows, seeing faces only she could see: her mother, her father, Robert, and the countless souls who had passed before her. A faint smile touched her lips. "I've seen England rise," she murmured, her voice barely more than breath. "And though I die, I leave her free." When dawn came, the bells of London tolled once again, slow, solemn, echoing across the grey sky. The Queen who had ruled for 45 years, who had never married, never bowed, never yielded, was gone. But outside, the city stirred with life. Merchants opened their shops, children ran through the cobbled streets, ships unfurled their sails upon the Thames. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the river and the tower that had once imprisoned her. Elizabeth. I was dead. But her England, her dream endured. And in that morning light, her words seemed to linger in the air, as if carried by the wind itself. "I may not have the body of a king, but I have the heart and soul of one, and it shall beat in England forever."